In the summer of 1856, the tobacco fields of Nottoway County, Virginia concealed a horror so profound that even hardened lawmen would struggle to describe it without their voices faltering. The Fairmont Plantation sprawled across 1,200 acres of rich southern soil, its prosperity built upon the systematic breaking of human spirits. But on the morning of July 20th, when the Sunday church bells rang across Southside Virginia, they were answered not by hymns but by screams of absolute terror. Silas Crane, the plantation's feared overseer, had been found in pieces. Not merely murdered, but systematically dismembered with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of anatomy. Before we descend further into this darkness, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What remained of him had been scattered across the property, and the dogs he had trained to hunt human beings were found with blood still fresh on their muzzles. The brutality of the scene defied comprehension, even in an era intimately familiar with violence. This is the investigation into Jacob Turner, the enslaved butcher who transformed his oppressor into carrion, feeding him to the very beasts Crane had weaponized against the defenseless. A tale of calculated revenge so methodical it chilled even those who secretly celebrated the overseer's demise. The records of Nottoway County survived the Civil War largely intact, preserved in the courthouse basement where they remained untouched for decades until historians began piecing together the fragments of forgotten atrocities. Among the property inventories filed in the spring of 1856, one entry stands out with chilling clarity. Jacob, Negro male, aged 28 years, skilled in butchery and livestock management, literate though not openly, valued at $1,800. Purchased from the estate of deceased Richard Townsend, December 1853. The notation is clinical, reducing a human being to monetary value and occupational utility. But what makes this entry particularly significant is a handwritten addition in different ink, added months later by a clerk's trembling hand. Subject of murder inquiry, July 1856. Whereabouts unknown. Presumed fled or deceased. The stark bureaucratic language cannot mask the terror that must have gripped the clerk's hand as he wrote those words, knowing what Jacob had done and wondering if he might return to claim more victims. Edmund Fairmont had purchased the Nottoway County property in 1848 with money inherited from his merchant father. The plantation produced moderate tobacco yields, but Fairmont himself rarely visited, preferring the comforts of Richmond society to the realities of agricultural management. He had hired Silas Crane in 1850 based on recommendations from other planters who praised Crane's ability to extract maximum labor through fear. What Fairmont chose not to investigate too closely was how Crane achieved such impressive productivity. The arrangement suited Fairmont perfectly, allowing him to profit from brutality while maintaining plausible ignorance about the methods employed. He visited the plantation 4 times yearly, staying 3 days each visit, just long enough to review ledgers and collect his profits before returning to the city. This willful blindness made him complicit in everything that followed, though he would spend years claiming shocked innocence when the truth emerged. Silas Crane had arrived in Virginia in 1842 as a transported convict, having been caught stealing horses in Yorkshire, England. The British judicial system offered him a choice between 14 years hard labor in Australia or indenture in the American South. He chose Virginia, calculating correctly that opportunities for advancement existed in a society desperate for men willing to enforce its peculiar institution through violence. Crane worked off his indenture by 1847 and immediately sought positions managing enslaved labor. He had learned during his own period of semi-bondage that fear was the most efficient management tool, and he applied this lesson with systematic cruelty. By 1850, he had earned a reputation among Virginia planters as someone who could break the most stubborn slaves, though whispers circulated about his methods. These whispers never quite coalesced into formal complaints because Crane delivered results, and in the economy of 1850s Virginia, productivity mattered more than morality. What made Crane particularly terrifying was his use of dogs. He had brought with him from England knowledge of how hunting hounds were trained, and he applied these techniques to create animals that would track and terrorize human beings. His pack consisted of 12 dogs, a mix of bloodhounds and mastiffs, housed in kennels he had constructed himself near his cottage. Crane trained these animals to respond to the scent of fear, to associate the smell of enslaved people with the hunt. He would release the dogs during punishments, letting them circle the victim while he administered whippings. The psychological impact of snarling animals waiting to tear flesh created a level of terror that ensured absolute obedience. Slaves on the Fairmont Plantation learned to recognize the sound of Crane's whistle calling the dogs, and that sound alone was enough to make grown men weep with fear. Children would hide when they heard the kennels stirring, knowing that someone was about to suffer. The records show that Crane maintained meticulous documentation of punishments administered, a habit perhaps developed during his own experience with English law. These punishment logs survived in the courthouse records, and they make for disturbing reading even a century and a half later. The entries are clinical, noting dates, infractions, and punishments delivered. December 3, 1854, Negro man Jacob refused direct order to work past nightfall, 15 lashes with dogs present. March 17, 1855, Negro man Jacob, caught with book, 20 lashes and 3 days reduced rations. September 9, 1855, Negro man Jacob, insolent response to correction, 10 lashes with dogs released for intimidation. The pattern reveals a specific antagonism between Crane and Jacob, an ongoing battle of wills that would eventually culminate in blood and horror. Jacob Turner had not been born on the Fairmont Plantation but had been purchased from the estate of Richard Townsend in December 1853. Townsend had been an unusual owner, a Quaker who kept slaves but treated them with a degree of humanity uncommon in Virginia. He had taught several of his slaves to read, including Jacob, justifying this technically illegal act by claiming they needed to understand livestock care manuals. Townsend's daughter Margaret had taken a particular interest in Jacob's education, secretly teaching him not just basic literacy but geography, history, and mathematics. When Townsend died suddenly of apoplexy in November 1853, his estate was liquidated to pay debts, and Jacob found himself sold at auction. The transition from Townsend's relatively humane management to Crane's systematic terror was catastrophic for Jacob's psychological state. He had experienced what something approaching dignity felt like, and having that stolen made slavery's chains feel even heavier. What made Jacob particularly valuable was his skill in butchery. Townsend had trained him in the proper slaughter and processing of livestock, skills that were economically crucial on any large plantation. Jacob knew how to kill efficiently, how to drain blood properly, how to dismember carcasses with minimal waste, and how to preserve meat through various methods. He understood anatomy with an intimacy that few possessed, knowing which cuts would kill instantly and which would cause prolonged suffering. He could break down an entire hog in under 20 minutes, his cleaver work so precise that he wasted virtually nothing. These skills made him indispensable to the plantation's operations, providing meat for both the enslaved workers and Fairmont's household. But they also gave Jacob knowledge that would eventually serve a far darker purpose than feeding people. He understood exactly how to take apart a human body because preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The underlying anatomy differed only in scale from the animals he processed daily. The smokehouse where Jacob worked stood about 100 yards from the main plantation house, a solid brick structure with thick walls designed to maintain consistent temperature for meat curing. Inside, the tools of his trade hung on walls or rested on wooden tables. Cleavers of various sizes, boning knives sharp enough to shave with, meat hooks on chains, hacksaws for cutting through bone, and various other implements that could transform a living creature into portions ready for consumption. Jacob kept these tools immaculately maintained, sharpening them daily, because dull tools made the work harder and increased suffering for the animals. This attention to his instruments would later serve him well when he needed them for something other than livestock. The smokehouse was Jacob's domain, a place where even Crane rarely ventured because the overseer found the smell of blood and smoke unpleasant. This gave Jacob a rare space of relative autonomy, a few hours each day when he could work without direct supervision, though the threat of Crane's inspection always loomed. Crane's cottage sat isolated from the other plantation buildings, positioned deliberately to give him privacy for activities he preferred to keep hidden from even casual observation. The stone structure was solidly built, with thick walls that muffled sound. Enslaved people whispered that screams from inside the cottage sometimes echoed across the property at night, though no one dared investigate. Crane lived alone, having never married, and his solitary existence suited his temperament. He took his meals in the cottage, rarely socializing even with Fairmont during the owner's quarterly visits. The kennels directly adjoined the cottage, allowing Crane to release his dogs at any hour. The proximity of the animals to his living space revealed something essential about Crane's psychology. He felt more comfortable with creatures trained to violence than with other human beings, and the constant presence of the dogs reinforced his sense of power and control. Every Saturday evening, Crane followed an unvarying routine. He would ride the 8 miles to Blackstone, Virginia, where he would drink at the town's tavern from roughly 7 in the evening until past midnight. The tavern keeper, a man named Hoskins, later testified that Crane typically consumed at least a full bottle of whiskey during these sessions, becoming progressively more talkative and boastful as the alcohol took effect. Crane would regale other patrons with stories of how he maintained discipline on the Fairmont Plantation, describing punishments in graphic detail that made even hardened slaveholders uncomfortable. He seemed to take particular pleasure in discussing his dogs and the fear they inspired. This Saturday ritual was well known to everyone on the plantation, and the enslaved population had learned that Saturday nights offered a brief respite from Crane's direct oversight. Of course, he always left instructions for his assistant overseer, a young white man named Peters who lived in town, but Peters rarely bothered to make rounds unless specifically summoned. This weekly pattern of Crane's absence would eventually provide the opportunity Jacob needed. The spring of 1856 brought changes to the Fairmont Plantation that set in motion the events of that bloody July. Edmund Fairmont had decided to expand his tobacco operations, which meant longer working hours and increased pressure on the enslaved population to meet production targets. Crane, always eager to demonstrate his value, increased the severity and frequency of punishments. The dogs were released more often, and the whipping post at the center of the property saw daily use. Jacob, despite his valuable skills, was not exempt from this intensified regime. Crane seemed to take particular satisfaction in targeting Jacob, perhaps because he sensed a defiance in the enslaved butcher that other slaves had long since abandoned. In March 1856, Crane caught Jacob with a small book he had somehow managed to keep hidden since his time with the Townsend family. The punishment was severe, 20 lashes delivered while the dog circled, snapping at Jacob's legs. Crane confiscated the book, a volume of Shakespeare's plays, and burned it in front of Jacob while laughing. That act of destroying one of the few connections Jacob maintained to his earlier, slightly more humane existence, planted a seed of pure hatred that would grow over the following months. But the true catalyst came in April when Crane announced his intention to kill the plantation's oldest dog, a mastiff named Judge who had become too arthritic to hunt effectively. Jacob had developed a strange relationship with Judge over the years, secretly feeding the old dog scraps from the smokehouse. Judge, unlike Crane's other dogs, had never been set upon Jacob during punishments, perhaps because even in his prime he had been too slow for Crane's purposes. The dog represented for Jacob a small connection to something that wasn't pure cruelty. When Crane decided to kill Judge, he assigned the task to Jacob, ordering him to butcher the dog as he would any livestock. The order was deliberately cruel, designed to break whatever small comfort Jacob had found. Jacob followed the order, killing Judge with a single precise blow to the skull, but something inside him shifted permanently that day. As he dismembered the old dog's body, Jacob found himself thinking not about the animal on his table but about the man who had ordered its death. The anatomical similarities between dog and human occupied his thoughts. The same joints, the same muscle structures, the same vulnerability of flesh when met with sharp steel. Jacob's decision to escape crystallized during the first week of April 1856, though the exact moment of determination is impossible to pinpoint with certainty. What the historical record does show is that his behavior underwent subtle changes that several witnesses noted decades later when their testimonies were finally recorded. Esther, the elderly woman who worked in the main house kitchen, remembered that Jacob had become quieter than usual, more observant during the brief moments when their paths crossed. Where he had previously engaged in the careful small talk that enslaved people used to maintain human connection without drawing overseer attention, he now simply watched and listened. His eyes, she recalled, had developed a quality she described as calculating, as though he were measuring distances and counting steps even during routine movements around the plantation. Young Thomas, who worked in the stables and occasionally helped Jacob move heavy carcasses, noticed that the butcher had begun asking casual questions about the roads leading north from the plantation, disguising his curiosity as idle conversation about where various supplies came from or which routes the tobacco wagons used to reach Petersburg. The planning was necessarily subtle because any overt preparation would have brought immediate and severe punishment. Jacob could not pack belongings he did not own, could not stockpile food without arousing suspicion, and could not confide in others without risking betrayal. The threat of being sold away or receiving devastating punishment often compelled enslaved people to inform on each other, and Jacob understood this reality too well to trust anyone with his intentions. What he could do was observe the rhythms of the plantation with heightened awareness, noting when guards were most alert and when they grew lax, identifying which paths through the surrounding woods were most heavily traveled and which offered concealment, and mentally cataloging every detail that might prove useful during a desperate flight. He paid particular attention to Crane's Saturday evening departures, timing how long the overseer remained absent and noting that Peters, the assistant overseer, rarely appeared on the property before mid-morning on Sundays even when Crane was away. The theft of small items began in mid-April, though calling it theft feels inadequate given that enslaved people were themselves considered stolen property. Jacob began taking coins when opportunity presented itself, a penny here, a nickel there, careful never to take enough at once to be noticed. He found these coins in the smokehouse where white workers or Fairmont himself occasionally visited and carelessly set down money while conducting business. Over several weeks, Jacob accumulated nearly $2, a sum that represented more money than he had ever personally possessed in his life. He hid these coins in a small leather pouch he had sewn from scrap material, concealing it beneath a loose floorboard in the smokehouse where he knew Crane never looked. The money would not buy his freedom, but it might buy food or assistance during his flight, and having it represented a tiny measure of agency in a life defined by powerlessness. He also began secretly setting aside small portions of the dried meat he processed, hiding strips of jerky in the same location as the coins. These acts of preparation felt simultaneously insignificant and momentous, small steps toward an uncertain future that might end in freedom or death. Jacob's knowledge of the route north came from fragments of information pieced together over years. Enslaved people developed their own information networks, passing news and knowledge through careful conversations that looked innocent to white observers. Jacob had heard whispers about Petersburg, about certain churches where sympathetic ministers might help fugitives, about roads that were less heavily patrolled than others. He knew the North Star's location and understood that following it would eventually lead to places where slavery's legal reach grew weaker, though he had only the vaguest understanding of actual geography beyond Virginia. The distance to Petersburg was approximately 35 miles, he had learned from overhearing conversations about tobacco transport, and he believed he could cover that distance in 2 nights of hard walking if he avoided roads during daylight. Whether anyone in Petersburg would actually help him remained unknown, but staying at Fairmont Plantation guaranteed only continued brutality under Crane's regime, so the gamble seemed worth the risk. The decision to flee came suddenly on April 23, triggered by an incident that made clear Jacob's situation was deteriorating beyond even its already terrible baseline. Crane had been drinking earlier than usual that afternoon, starting before his typical Saturday departure for Blackstone, and in his partially intoxicated state he had decided to conduct an inspection of the smokehouse. Jacob was in the middle of processing a hog when Crane entered, his presence immediately filling the space with tension. The overseer began examining Jacob's work with exaggerated scrutiny, looking for any imperfection that could justify punishment. He found it, or claimed to, in the thickness of some bacon cuts, declaring them uneven and wasteful. Crane's voice grew louder as he berated Jacob, his words slurring slightly from the whiskey already in his system. Then, almost casually, Crane mentioned that he had been speaking with Fairmont about selling off some of the older slaves who were becoming less productive, and that perhaps they should consider selling Jacob as well, since clearly he could not maintain proper standards in his work. The threat hung in the air between them, and Jacob understood that Crane was testing him, watching for any reaction that could justify immediate violence. Jacob maintained absolute stillness during Crane's tirade, his face carefully blank, his eyes fixed on the floor in the posture of submission that enslaved people learned to adopt for survival. But inside, something fundamental shifted. The threat of being sold away meant potential separation from the only environment he knew, possible sale to an even worse situation, and the loss of any small advantages his butchery skills provided. More than that, it represented Crane's absolute power to destroy Jacob's life on a whim, to erase what little stability existed in his daily existence. After Crane finally left, stumbling slightly as he walked back toward his cottage to prepare for his evening trip to Blackstone, Jacob stood motionless in the smokehouse for several minutes, his hands still holding the cleaver he had been using. He realized he was gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and that he had been unconsciously imagining driving the blade into Crane's skull. The intensity of that imagined violence frightened him, but it also clarified his thinking. He could not remain on this plantation any longer without losing whatever remained of his humanity, and he could not trust that tomorrow or next week would offer a better opportunity for escape than tonight presented. The actual departure happened with less drama than later accounts would suggest. Jacob simply walked away from the plantation during the early hours of April 24th, a Sunday morning when Crane would still be sleeping off his Saturday drinking and when Peters would not arrive for several more hours. He had retrieved his hidden pouch of coins and dried meat, tucked them inside his shirt, and then left the slave quarters where he was housed with about 20 other enslaved men. No elaborate disguises were possible, no clever ruses to delay discovery of his absence. He just walked north through the dark fields, moving as quickly as he dared while avoiding the main road. The night was cloudy, obscuring the stars he had planned to navigate by, but the general direction was clear enough. Away from the plantation. Away from Crane. Toward something that might be freedom or might be death, but would at least represent his own choice rather than submission to another day of brutality. The journey toward Petersburg tested every assumption Jacob had made about his chances. The first hours went smoothly enough as he covered ground quickly through farmland and patches of forest, but as dawn approached he was forced to find hiding places to avoid being seen. Virginia law required enslaved people to carry written passes when traveling, and any white person could demand to see these documents. A black man traveling alone without paperwork would immediately be assumed to be a fugitive, leading to arrest and return to his owner. Jacob spent the first day hidden in a dense thicket of underbrush near a creek, hungry and terrified, listening to the sounds of normal daytime activity in the distance while remaining absolutely still to avoid detection. The creek provided water but also attracted other people, and twice during that long day Jacob heard voices close enough that he could make out words. He pressed himself flat against the ground, barely breathing, until the speakers moved away. The fear during those moments was unlike anything he had experienced even under Crane's whip, because discovery now would mean not just punishment but the destruction of any future hope. The second night brought him within perhaps 10 miles of Petersburg, though his exact location remained unclear in the darkness. His feet had developed painful blisters from walking in shoes that were already worn thin before he started, and hunger had moved beyond discomfort into something more urgent. The dried meat he had brought was nearly gone, rationed too carefully to provide real sustenance. Fatigue was becoming dangerous, slowing his movements and dulling his alertness when he most needed to remain sharp. Jacob had begun to wonder whether he would actually reach Petersburg or simply collapse from exhaustion in some anonymous field when fortune intervened in the form of a chance encounter that would alter the entire trajectory of his flight. He had been following a small road that seemed to head roughly north when he heard the distinctive sound of a horse-drawn wagon approaching from behind. Instinct told him to hide, but exhaustion and desperation made him take a calculated risk. He stepped to the side of the road, not quite hiding but not presenting himself boldly either, and waited to see who appeared. The wagon was driven by a black man who appeared to be in his middle years, broad-shouldered and moving with the confidence of someone traveling legitimately. Jacob noticed immediately that the driver sat upright without the hunched defensive posture that enslaved people typically adopted, and that the wagon itself was well maintained rather than being one of the deteriorating vehicles slaves were usually forced to use. As the wagon drew closer, the driver's eyes met Jacob's, and something unspoken passed between them. The driver's expression showed neither surprise nor alarm, just a kind of weary recognition. He slowed the wagon without stopping completely and spoke in a low voice that barely carried over the sound of the horse's hooves. "You look like a man who has lost his way," the driver said, phrasing that could mean anything to a casual observer but which carried obvious implications given the circumstances. Jacob made a split-second decision to trust this stranger, responding that he was indeed uncertain of his path and hoped to reach Petersburg. The driver nodded slightly and gestured toward the back of the wagon where several large sacks filled the cargo bed. "A man seeking Petersburg might find the journey easier with rest," the driver said carefully. "Best to rest out of the sun if the day is to be long and warm." Jacob understood the offer and climbed into the wagon bed as quickly as his exhausted body would allow, wedging himself between the sacks where he would be hidden from casual view. The driver's name was Daniel Blackwood, though Jacob would not learn this until later. Blackwood was a free black man who operated as a blacksmith in Petersburg, one of a relatively small number of free black people who had managed to establish themselves in skilled trades in Virginia's cities. His freedom had been purchased years earlier by his own father, who had spent decades accumulating the necessary funds, and Blackwood had built a modest but stable life for himself through careful navigation of Virginia's complex racial codes. What Jacob did not know during that wagon ride, hidden among the sacks and drifting in and out of exhausted sleep, was that Blackwood made regular trips into the countryside ostensibly to purchase raw materials for his blacksmithing work, but actually serving as a link in the network of people who assisted fugitive slaves. Blackwood's legitimate business provided cover for movements that would otherwise attract suspicion, and his status as a free black man gave him privileges that enslaved people did not possess, though those privileges were always precarious and subject to revocation if white authorities decided he had overstepped boundaries. The journey to Petersburg took most of the day, and Jacob remained hidden in the wagon bed even as he heard the sounds of the city growing closer. Voices became more frequent, the road surface changed from dirt to something more solid, and the general noise level increased in ways that signaled urban density. When the wagon finally stopped, Blackwood waited several minutes before speaking, probably checking to ensure no one was paying attention. Then he quietly told Jacob to remain exactly where he was, that someone would come for him after dark, and that he should under no circumstances emerge or make noise before then. The wagon shifted slightly as Blackwood climbed down, and then Jacob was alone again, hidden among the sacks in what he assumed must be Blackwood's property in Petersburg. The hours that followed were agonizing. Jacob desperately needed to relieve himself, his thirst had become acute, and every sound outside the wagon made him fear discovery. But he forced himself to remain motionless and silent, trusting that the stranger who had helped him would follow through on his implied promise of further assistance. True darkness had fallen when someone finally approached the wagon. Jacob heard footsteps and then Blackwood's voice speaking low but clear. "You can come out now, carefully, and follow me quickly without speaking." Jacob extracted himself from his hiding place with difficulty, his muscles cramped from hours of immobility, and followed Blackwood's silhouette through a yard and into a building that smelled of coal smoke and metal. Once inside with the door closed behind them, Blackwood lit a small lantern that revealed they were in a workshop filled with the tools of blacksmithing. Blackwood studied Jacob for a moment and then asked a simple question. "Nottoway County?" Jacob nodded, surprised that Blackwood had identified his origins so quickly. The blacksmith's expression showed no surprise at the confirmation. "There has been word of a fugitive from that area," he said matter-of-factly. "An overseer named Crane has been making inquiries and has sent messages to slave catchers. They are looking for a man matching your description." Jacob felt his stomach drop at this news, though part of him had known that Crane would not simply accept his disappearance. Blackwood continued speaking, his tone practical rather than sympathetic. "You cannot stay in Petersburg openly. The risk is too high. But there are people who might help, if you are willing to trust them further than you have already trusted me." Blackwood explained that there was a minister in Petersburg, a white man named Augustus Webb, who operated what amounted to a safe house for fugitive slaves attempting to reach northern states. Webb's activities were technically criminal under Virginia law, and he took considerable risks by offering such assistance, but he had managed to avoid serious legal trouble through a combination of careful discretion and protection from a few influential congregants who sympathized with his views. Blackwood could take Jacob to Webb's house that very night if Jacob was willing to take the risk. The alternative was to simply continue north on his own, though Blackwood warned that slave catchers were actively patrolling the roads leading out of Petersburg, having been alerted by plantation owners throughout the region about recent escapes. Jacob understood he was being offered a choice between accepting help from unknown white people who might betray him and attempting to continue alone with almost no resources and professional hunters looking for him. The decision was not difficult. He agreed to meet this Reverend Webb and hoped that the man's reputation for helping fugitives was deserved rather than being a trap. The walk to Webb's residence took about 20 minutes through Petersburg's dark streets, with Blackwood setting a pace that appeared casual but covered ground efficiently. They avoided the most well-lit areas and Blackwood occasionally paused to check their surroundings before proceeding. Jacob noticed that the blacksmith moved with practiced ease through the city, clearly familiar with routes that offered relative privacy. The house they finally approached was a modest two-story structure in a respectable but not wealthy neighborhood, the kind of home that suggested its occupant held a profession of some standing but was not among the town's elite. Blackwood led Jacob around to the rear entrance and knocked in a specific pattern, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a white man in his late 30s with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that assessed Jacob with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable in its directness. Augustus Webb had the kind of face that seemed designed to inspire trust, with even features and an expression of calm attentiveness that probably served him well in his ministerial duties. He greeted Blackwood by name and then looked at Jacob with what appeared to be genuine concern rather than the evaluating gaze Jacob had learned to expect from white people. "Come inside quickly," Webb said, his voice carrying the educated accent of someone with formal learning. "You are safe here, though I must know your circumstances in order to help you properly." Once inside with the door secured behind them, Webb led them to a small room at the back of the house that appeared to serve as a study. The room contained a desk covered with papers, shelves lined with books, and several chairs. Webb gestured for Jacob to sit and then positioned himself in another chair at a distance that felt respectful rather than intimidating. Blackwood remained standing near the door, clearly intending to leave once Jacob was settled. Before the blacksmith departed, Webb thanked him quietly and the 2 men exchanged a look that suggested long familiarity and shared purpose. Then Blackwood was gone and Jacob found himself alone with this white minister who supposedly helped fugitive slaves. Webb's questions were practical rather than probing into emotional territory. Where had Jacob come from? How long had he been traveling? Was he injured or ill? Did he know whether pursuit had been organized? And what were his intentions regarding future movement? Jacob answered carefully, still uncertain whether this apparent kindness concealed some trap, but Webb's responses suggested genuine engagement with the problem of getting Jacob to safety. The minister explained that moving fugitives north from Petersburg required careful coordination because Virginia authorities had become increasingly vigilant about enforcing fugitive slave laws, and that rushing the process often led to recapture. Webb proposed that Jacob remain hidden in his house for perhaps a week while arrangements were made for the next stage of northward movement, and that during this time Jacob should remain in a concealed room that Webb maintained specifically for sheltering fugitives. The room in question was accessed through a false panel in the study wall, creating a space perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet where someone could stay hidden even if authorities searched the house. It contained a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and a few books, offering basic survival but nothing resembling comfort. The week Jacob spent hidden in Webb's house represented a strange interlude between the terror of the plantation and whatever uncertain future awaited. Webb visited several times each day, bringing food and water, engaging Jacob in conversations that ranged across topics Jacob had never discussed with a white person. The minister seemed genuinely curious about Jacob's experiences and thoughts rather than making assumptions based on race. It was during these conversations that Jacob revealed his literacy, something he had kept carefully hidden on the plantation because education in enslaved people was often seen as threatening by owners. Webb's face had lit up with delight at this discovery, and he immediately began bringing books for Jacob to read during the long hours of hiding. The two men discussed literature, theology, history, and philosophy in ways that made Jacob feel momentarily human rather than property. Webb spoke about his own history, how he had lost his wife to cholera 2 years earlier and how that loss had intensified his commitment to working against slavery. His wife had shared his abolitionist convictions, and after her death Webb had thrown himself into more active assistance of fugitives as a way of honoring her memory. But the peace of those days was illusory, built on the fragile foundation of concealment in a city where slave catchers operated with legal impunity. On the 5th day of Jacob's stay, Webb entered the hidden room with an expression of barely controlled alarm. "There has been a development," the minister said without preamble. "A slave catcher named Garrett Holt has arrived in Petersburg with specific information about your escape. He has been making inquiries at churches and businesses, offering a substantial reward for information leading to your capture. Holt is known to be extremely effective at his profession, and he has brought bloodhounds that he claims can track even old trails. We need to move your departure forward rather than waiting for the arrangements I had been making." Jacob felt the familiar dread returning, the brief moment of safety dissolving as the reality of pursuit reasserted itself. Webb continued speaking rapidly, explaining that there was another man, someone who worked with the network of people helping fugitives, who could take Jacob further north that very night. This man was not part of the usual routes because he was considered too willing to use violence against slave catchers, but under the circumstances Webb believed the risk of waiting outweighed concerns about methods. The man Webb described went only by the name Benjamin, though everyone who knew him suspected this was false. He spoke with a German accent that suggested European origins, and he had appeared in Virginia several years earlier without much explanation of his background. Some speculated he was a former soldier who had fought in European wars and found himself drawn to America's own moral conflict over slavery. Whatever his history, Benjamin had developed a reputation for being willing to confront slave catchers directly rather than relying only on stealth and evasion. This willingness to use force made him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to the network of abolitionists, because violence drew attention and could lead to legal repercussions for everyone involved. But Webb explained that if Garrett Holt was already in Petersburg with dogs, conventional escape methods might not succeed, and Benjamin's more aggressive approach might be necessary. Jacob met Benjamin that evening, and the German made an immediate impression. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, heavily built with scarred hands and cold eyes that suggested intimate familiarity with violence. His accent was thick but his English vocabulary was extensive, and he spoke with a directness that bordered on bluntness. "You understand that leaving Petersburg now, with this hunter and his dogs already searching, is extremely dangerous," Benjamin said without preamble. "If we are discovered, there will likely be violence, and I will not hesitate to kill anyone who attempts to take you back to slavery. You must accept that reality before we proceed." Jacob found himself both frightened and oddly reassured by this stark assessment. Benjamin was not offering false comfort or pretending the situation was less dangerous than it obviously was. Jacob agreed that he understood the risks and was willing to proceed. Benjamin nodded with satisfaction and then outlined a plan that involved moving at night through routes that would avoid main roads, with Benjamin providing armed protection if they encountered slave catchers. The German produced a knife with a blade nearly 8 inches long and handed it to Jacob. "If we are attacked," he said simply, "you must be prepared to fight for your freedom rather than allowing yourself to be taken." Jacob took the knife, feeling the weight of it in his hand, and wondered whether he would actually be capable of using it against another human being if the moment came. The departure from Petersburg happened during the deepest hours before dawn on June 3rd, when even the most vigilant watchers grew drowsy and attention wavered. Benjamin moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, leading Jacob along paths that seemed almost invisible in the dim starlight. The German carried a rifle slung across his back and had multiple pistols tucked into his belt, an arsenal that Jacob found both comforting and terrifying in its implications. They avoided the main northern roads entirely, instead cutting through farmland and wooded areas where the risk of encountering patrols was minimized though not eliminated. Benjamin maintained silence during their movement, communicating through hand gestures when necessary, and Jacob followed his lead with the desperate focus of someone who understood this might be his last chance at freedom. The knife Benjamin had given him remained tucked into Jacob's waistband, a cold weight against his skin that reminded him constantly of how quickly circumstances could turn violent. Dawn found them perhaps 15 miles north of Petersburg, hidden in a dense stand of trees near a stream where they could rest during daylight hours without being easily spotted. Benjamin finally spoke, his accented voice quiet but carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "The hunter Holt is not a man who gives up easily," he said without looking at Jacob. "He will assume you have gone north and will follow with his dogs. Our advantage is that we left from a location the dogs cannot easily track from, but once Holt determines the general direction he will be persistent. We must reach the next safe house before he narrows his search area." Jacob asked where this next safe house was located, and Benjamin's response was deliberately vague. "2 more nights of travel if we are fortunate," he said. 3 if we encounter complications. The place is operated by people who are even more committed than Reverend Webb, if such a thing is possible, but the route to reach them requires crossing areas where slave catchers are known to patrol regularly. Benjamin pulled dried meat and bread from his pack, offering portions to Jacob. "Eat and rest now," he instructed. "We will not move again until darkness returns, and you will need strength for what comes next." The day passed with agonizing slowness as both men remained hidden and alert. Jacob found himself thinking about the plantation he had fled, wondering whether Crane had organized a massive search or whether the overseer had simply reported his absence and waited for professional slave catchers to handle the problem. The thought of Crane brought a surge of hatred so intense it surprised Jacob with its physicality. He realized his hands had clenched into fists and his breathing had become shallow, and he forced himself to relax before Benjamin noticed and asked questions. But the hatred remained, a burning core of rage that had been building for years and now had nowhere to discharge itself. Jacob had escaped the immediate source of his torment, but Crane still existed back at the plantation, still wielded his power over the other enslaved people, still used his dogs to terrorize human beings. The injustice of it gnawed at Jacob's thoughts, making it difficult to focus on his own precarious situation. Benjamin noticed Jacob's distraction and seemed to understand its source without requiring explanation. "Hatred is useful fuel for survival," the German said quietly, "but it can also cloud judgment when clear thinking is most necessary. You must find a way to carry your anger without letting it control your actions, at least until you are truly safe." His words carried the weight of personal experience, suggesting Benjamin himself had learned this lesson through bitter circumstances. Jacob asked whether Benjamin had been a soldier in Europe, and the German's slight smile suggested the question was both expected and unwelcome. "I have seen enough war to understand that violence is sometimes necessary but never glorious," Benjamin replied. "I came to America believing I had left such things behind, but discovered that this country has its own war, one fought in the shadows between those who profit from owning human beings and those who recognize such ownership as an abomination. I chose my side in this conflict, and I do not regret that choice even when it requires me to do things that weigh on my conscience." The second night of travel proved more difficult than the first. Heavy clouds had rolled in during the afternoon, bringing intermittent rain that made the ground treacherous and reduced visibility to almost nothing. Benjamin adjusted their route repeatedly, apparently navigating by some internal map that Jacob could not perceive, and their pace slowed considerably as they picked their way through mud and undergrowth. Several times they heard sounds in the darkness that might have been other travelers or might have been animals, and each time Benjamin froze into absolute stillness until he was satisfied the sounds posed no threat. Around what Jacob estimated must be near midnight, they approached a small road that Benjamin clearly needed to cross, but the German paused at the tree line and gestured for Jacob to remain absolutely still. Voices carried through the rain, men speaking in the casual tones of people who were bored rather than alert. Benjamin waited nearly 20 minutes until the voices faded into distance, then quickly led Jacob across the road and back into concealing forest on the other side. Dawn on June 4 found them sheltering in an abandoned farm building, a structure whose roof had partially collapsed but which still offered some protection from the rain that continued falling steadily. Benjamin had grown increasingly tense as the night progressed, and now he explained why. "We are in an area where slave catchers are particularly active," he said, checking and rechecking his weapons. "There is a group of men who operate from a town about 10 miles east of here, professionals who coordinate their efforts and share information about fugitives. If Holt has contacted them, as he almost certainly has, then they will be watching the routes heading north from Petersburg." Benjamin's jaw tightened as he continued. "I had hoped we would pass through this area before Holt could organize such coordination, but the rain has slowed us more than I anticipated. We must be extraordinarily careful today and tonight, because if we are spotted the response will be swift and probably involve multiple hunters working together." The day passed in miserable dampness as rain continued to fall and water gradually found its way through gaps in the damaged roof. Jacob's clothes were soaked through, and he began shivering uncontrollably as his body temperature dropped. Benjamin noticed and moved closer, sharing body heat in a gesture that felt oddly intimate given how little they actually knew each other. The German began talking quietly, perhaps to distract Jacob from his discomfort, telling stories about his youth in Bavaria and his military service in various European conflicts. He described battles with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested he had long since processed the trauma they represented, but occasionally his voice would catch on certain details that clearly still affected him. "There was a siege," Benjamin said at one point, "where we were reduced to eating rats and leather to survive. I thought then that I understood the depths of human suffering, but what I have seen in this country, the systematic dehumanization of an entire race, has shown me that cruelty can take forms even more insidious than warfare. At least in battle, your enemy acknowledges you as human even while trying to kill you. Slavery denies even that basic recognition." Night fell again and Benjamin made the decision to move despite the continuing rain, arguing that the reduced visibility actually worked in their favor by making it harder for watchers to spot them at distance. They set out into the darkness and had covered perhaps 3 miles when disaster struck. The sound of dogs baying carried through the rain-soaked night, distant but unmistakable, and Benjamin's face went rigid with tension. "Those are tracking hounds," he said unnecessarily, already changing direction to lead them toward a creek he apparently knew was nearby. "Water will confuse their scent, at least temporarily, but if the hunters are experienced they will know to search both upstream and downstream from where the trail ends. We must move quickly and be prepared to fight if flight proves impossible." Jacob felt fear coursing through him with physical force, making his legs weak and his hands shake. The knife Benjamin had given him suddenly felt inadequate against professional hunters with guns and dogs trained specifically for this purpose. They reached the creek and waded into water that came up to Jacob's thighs, cold enough to make him gasp. Benjamin led them downstream, moving as quickly as possible while trying not to create sounds that would carry through the night. The baying of the dogs seemed to be getting closer, and now Jacob could hear men's voices calling to each other, coordinating their search pattern. Benjamin suddenly pulled Jacob toward the bank and into a tangle of brush that overhung the water, pressing both of them into the mud beneath the vegetation. "Stay absolutely still," the German whispered directly into Jacob's ear, "and if they find us anyway, use that knife without hesitation because they will show you no mercy." Jacob nodded against Benjamin's shoulder, fighting to control his breathing as the sounds of pursuit drew nearer. The hunters passed within perhaps 20 yards of their hiding place, close enough that Jacob could make out individual words of their conversation. One man was complaining about the rain, another was expressing confidence that the dogs would pick up the scent again soon, and a third voice, harder and more authoritative than the others, was giving instructions about search patterns. That third voice sent chills through Jacob because it carried absolute confidence, the tone of a man who had done this many times before and expected success. The dogs splashed through the creek nearby, their handlers encouraging them to find where the scent trail resumed, and for several agonizing minutes Jacob was certain discovery was imminent. Then, inexplicably, the hunters moved on, heading further downstream with their dogs, apparently convinced the fugitives had continued in that direction rather than hiding so close to where the trail ended. Benjamin waited nearly half an hour after the sounds of pursuit had faded completely before moving. When he finally extracted them from the hiding place, his expression was grim. "That was Holt," he said quietly. "I recognized his voice from descriptions I have heard. He is as dangerous as his reputation suggests, and he will not give up the search easily. We must assume he will return to this area once he realizes the trail does not continue downstream, which means we need to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and this location before dawn." Benjamin led them back into the creek, but this time headed upstream, moving with renewed urgency that communicated itself to Jacob despite his exhaustion. They traveled through the water for what felt like hours, Jacob's feet becoming numb from the cold and his muscles screaming with fatigue, but Benjamin showed no signs of stopping or even slowing. Eventually they emerged from the creek and Benjamin led them through forest that gradually gave way to cultivated fields. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they finally reached a small farm that looked barely distinguishable from dozens of others they had passed. Benjamin approached with visible caution, circling the property once before finally moving toward the main house. He knocked on the door in what was clearly another coded pattern, and after a moment the door opened to reveal an elderly white woman whose expression showed no surprise at finding two muddy, exhausted men on her doorstep before sunrise. She gestured them inside without speaking and quickly shut the door behind them. "Benjamin," the woman said simply, "I had not expected you for another few days." The German explained about Holt and the close encounter with the hunters, and the woman's face tightened with concern. "He is thorough and will certainly search this area eventually," she said. "Your friend cannot stay here more than one night at most. I will send word ahead to the next station that you are coming, and that time is critical." The woman identified herself only as Rachel and made no mention of her last name or why she risked harboring fugitive slaves. She provided hot food and dry clothes for both men, directing them to a concealed cellar beneath her kitchen where they could rest during the daylight hours. The cellar was barely large enough for both men to lie down, but it was warm and dry, luxuries that felt almost decadent after the past days of misery. Jacob fell into exhausted sleep almost immediately, his body simply shutting down after having been pushed beyond reasonable limits. When he woke several hours later, Benjamin was already awake and speaking quietly with Rachel, who had descended into the cellar with more food. The conversation stopped when they noticed Jacob had awakened, but not before he caught enough to understand they were discussing contingency plans if Holt's search reached this property. Rachel explained that they needed to leave that very night despite the minimal rest, because she had received word through her network that Holt was indeed systematically searching farms in the area and would likely reach her property within the next day or two. The next safe house was approximately 20 miles north, farther than they had covered in any previous night of travel, but Benjamin believed they could manage the distance if they pushed hard and encountered no delays. Jacob listened to these plans with a growing sense of unreality, as though he were hearing about someone else's desperate flight rather than his own. The past weeks had taken on a dreamlike quality where each day brought new terrors and new strangers who either helped or hunted him, and he found himself struggling to maintain hope that this would eventually lead to actual freedom rather than just prolonged suffering before inevitable recapture. Benjamin seemed to sense Jacob's flagging spirits and spoke with uncharacteristic gentleness. "I know the weight of despair," he said. "I have carried it myself at times when circumstances seemed impossible. But you must understand that every mile we travel north increases your chances of survival and diminishes Holt's ability to continue pursuit. The network of people helping you extends far beyond what you can see, and many of them take extraordinary risks because they believe in your right to freedom. Do not surrender to hopelessness when so many others refuse to surrender you to slavery." His words did not eliminate Jacob's exhaustion or fear, but they provided enough resolve to face another night of desperate flight through hostile territory. They departed Rachel's farm as full darkness fell, moving with the controlled urgency that had become their standard pace. The night was clearer than previous ones, offering better visibility but also making them more exposed to potential watchers. Benjamin led them along field edges and through patches of forest, always choosing routes that offered maximum concealment even when it meant slower progress. Around midnight they heard dogs again, distant but definitely tracking, and Benjamin's face showed the first real sign of fear Jacob had seen from the normally impassive German. "Holt must have found our trail from Rachel's farm sooner than expected," Benjamin said, already increasing their pace to something just short of a run. We cannot outrun dogs indefinitely, but if we can reach the next safe house before they close the distance, the people there have methods of hiding fugitives that even bloodhounds cannot easily defeat. Jacob pushed his exhausted body to match Benjamin's pace, drawing on reserves of strength he did not know he still possessed, driven by the primal terror of being caught after having come so far. The race through the darkness that followed would remain fragmented in Jacob's memory, a blur of motion and fear and physical agony. His lungs burned, his legs felt as though they might simply stop working, and the sounds of pursuing dogs seemed to grow steadily closer despite their desperate speed. Benjamin repeatedly altered their course, apparently trying to confuse the trail or by precious minutes, but the pursuit remained relentless. Dawn was beginning to break when they finally saw buildings ahead that Benjamin identified as their destination. Almost there, the German gasped, his own exhaustion finally showing. Another few minutes and we can reach safety. They covered the final distance in a desperate sprint, Benjamin pounding on the door of a substantial farmhouse as the baying of hounds grew terrifyingly close. The door opened to reveal a tall black man whose expression shifted from surprise to understanding to urgency in rapid succession. "Inside now," the man commanded, and both Jacob and Benjamin stumbled across the threshold. The man immediately shut and barred the door, then led them at a run through the house to what appeared to be a normal bedroom. He pulled back a rug to reveal a trapdoor in the floor, opening it to show a space beneath that had clearly been designed specifically for hiding fugitives. "Get in and remain absolutely silent," the man ordered. "The hunters may search the house, and your lives depend on them finding nothing." Jacob lowered himself into the cramped space, followed by Benjamin, and the trapdoor closed above them, plunging them into complete darkness. They heard the rug being replaced, and then footsteps moving away as their rescuer went to prepare for the arrival of the slave catchers who were surely only minutes behind them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.